Everybody ready for a nap?
Yeah.
I am too. Dan came over Thursday and yesterday, and we cut up that tree that fell in our yard. And let me tell you, we were sapped at the end of the day. It was nice and warm, sunny, and I slept well last night, and I'm still feeling the effects of it today. So I will see if everybody behaves themselves. We are talking about parables, and I appreciate Paige put together these little packets. And Miss Yura, did you help out with that? You helped out with it. We got these really nice little packets, and I appreciate that, because sometimes it's like I would love for something like that to happen, but time escapes me and I'm not able to do that. But we've got these really nice things, and next week we're going to use them because we're going to get into our first parable next week. I thought that I had all of my information on my computer, and I did not. I don't have my answer key for the first parable, so we're not going to get into the first parable today. But I did think that we could continue on discussing a few things in regards to a preparation for the study of the parables. You know, people talk about the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and the truth of the matter is, a third of everything he spoke was in parable form. So if we can't understand parables, we're not really able to understand everything he taught. And a lot of times, if we do a surface study of the parables, we really don't get into some of the really meatier details of what we. And a lot of times, we'll overlook some of the parables that they're not readily apparent. So what do? Well, that's not really as important. We talk about the ones that we're very comfortable with. The prodigal son. We talk about the Good Samaritan. We talk about the parable of the soils. But there's a great many more that are just as important. And they're all leading the people that he's teaching at that time. They're all leading. It's all leading towards the coming of the kingdom of God, which is, of course, the church. Okay, so we need to understand the parables if we're going to say that we understand what Jesus spoke. All right, so we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of other parables. These are not from the mouth of Christ. They are not from divinely inspired men, but they are parables, because a parable is really a story. Many people spoke parables. That's why it says that Jesus spoke in parables, and it doesn't describe the teachings of Jesus as the only parables. He spoke to them in words that they could understand. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I want you to tell me if you think you could tell me what the meanings behind these are. Here's a couple of them. An old man on the point of death summoned his sons around him to give them some parting advice. He ordered his servants to bring in a bundle of sticks, and he said to his eldest son, "Break it." The son strained and with all of his efforts, but was unable to break the bundle in two. The other sons also tried, but none of them was successful. "Untie the bundle," said the father, "and each of you take a stick." When they had done so, he called out to them, "Now break the stick," and each one of them was easily broken. "You see my meaning," says their father. Okay? We read that, and of course, the meaning may be readily apparent. It may not have been to the people who were hearing it for the first time. This is an Aesop's fable, so if this gives you any indication about how long ago, this is early days of Greece. So this is a long time ago. All right, so the idea here is that this actually predates Christ, if that tells you anything. So, having that in mind, what was the fable? What was the meaning behind the fable? Union gives strength. Okay? The bundle was unable to be broken, but when it was unbundled and it had many people, you think of the idea of a group, many people bundled together, it's not easily broken. But when it's broken apart, each of these is easily broken. Now, having said that, would that be something that that could have a spiritual meaning behind it? Certainly so. Absolutely. When does the church have its greatest strength? When it is not even to gather together in a common place, but when it has common purpose and has common goals, and it speaks all things in union and the idea of unity. Did Jesus speak about unity? Yes. He says, "I desire that you say the same thing, you speak the same thing." He wanted us to be unified. Does it mean that we're always going to agree? No, not always going to agree. But as long as it's in matters of opinion, disagreement is okay. But when it comes to doctrine, we must speak the same thing. Union means strength. All right, so we got that one. All right, here's another one. Two gamecocks were fiercely fighting for the mastery of the farmyard. One at last put the other one to flight, and the vanquished cock skulked away and hid himself in a quiet corner. while the conqueror, flying up to a high wall, flapped his wings and crowed exultingly with all of his might. An eagle, sailing through the air, pounced upon him and carried him off in his talons. The vanquished cock immediately came out of his corner and ruled henceforth with undisputed mastery. What's the meaning behind it? That certainly feeds into the overall theme of it. Pride goes before destruction, right? Can we get a spiritual meaning behind that? Absolutely, absolutely. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and Scripture tells us that. One who humbles himself will be exalted. One who exalts himself will be humbled. Who does that? God does that, right? Okay, God's behind that. God takes the prideful and he brings them down. He humbles them. They will be humbled, if not in this life, certainly in the next. But one who humbles himself, as Jesus humbled himself, remember, he humbled himself to the point where he was a servant to those that he served. Okay? And what was going to happen? God was going to take Jesus and he was going to exalt him. He was going to bring him up. He was going to set him at his right hand to rule. Okay? So those are two examples of parables. They take a deep concept, a very deep concept, and they bring it to a very simple imagery. And you think about it, who can you instruct with a parable? Anyone. Anyone. Even people who maybe have a hard time. There are folks who have a hard time with deeper thoughts. It's a point of the capacity of the brain to process. But you can take even a small child and you can give them a parable and they can understand a parable because it brings it down to a language that is readily understood by everyone. Here's one in Judges chapter 9, verses 7 through 15. Judges chapter 9, verses 7 through 15. This is Jotham's parable. When Jotham heard about this, he climbed to the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem. Listen to me if you want God to listen to you." Okay, so he's giving them a commandment. All right? If you want God to listen to you, listen to me. Once upon a time, the trees decided to elect a king. First they said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree refused, saying, "Should I quit producing the olive oil that blesses both God and people just to wave back and forth across the trees?" Then they said to the fig tree, "Be our king." But the fig tree also refused, saying, "Should I quit producing my sweet fruit just to wave back and forth over the trees?" Then they said to the grapevine, "Be our king." But the grapevine also refused, saying, "Should I quit producing the wine that cheers both God and people, just to wave back and forth across the trees?" Then all the trees finally turned to the thorn bush and said, "Come, you be our king." And the thorn bush replied to the trees, "If you truly want to make me your king, come and take shelter in my shade. If not, let fire come out from me and devour the cedars of Lebanon." All right. So here's a parable. Parables predate Christ. And there are more than this. If you go back even further, you start looking at some of the books of the Bible, and you'll find parables are not always very lengthy things. They don't have long, drawn-out narratives. Sometimes it's very simple. Okay, the idea of the parable of the mustard seed, very short. Okay, when it's small, it's of the smallest of the seeds, and when it's fully grown, the birds of the air can come and rest in its branches. They come and roost. Sometimes very small, but very, very powerful lessons to be found in those. Okay, all right. So here's just a little bit more information in regards to a parable. Let's start with the lowest level word, a metaphor. What's a metaphor? What's a metaphor? Okay, it's a figure of speech, and what does it do? Okay, it's a word or a phrase literally denoting one object or idea that is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or an analogy between them, the idea of analogy. Metaphor is language that directly compares seemingly unrelated subjects. For example, "You are my sunshine." What does that mean? You are my sunshine. Yeah. There's something about you that brightens up my day, that brightens up my life. We say that a lot of times to children. There's a children's song, "You are my sunshine." All right. It's the idea. What do you do? It's comparing the effects that the sun has on us to the effects of what that person has, the effect that person has in our lives. Okay, so we have the idea of a metaphor. Now, an analogy Here's an analogy. There's a metaphor, but here's the analogy. An analogy is the inference that if two things agree with each other in some respects, they will probably agree in other respects as well. All right? For example, shells were to ancient cultures as dollar bills are to modern culture. In what way? Yeah, they were used as commerce. They were used as methods of payment as commerce towards one another, okay? This said idea, that's an analogy. I mean, that is the analogy. Shells were to ancient cultures as dollar bills are to us. That's the analogy. It's comparing two things. And it's likely, as if it were true then, it's true now. Is that one of the reasons that the parables that we read about, they mean as much to us now as they did to the people back then, don't they? Yeah, there's some phraseology that sometimes we might not quite understand. The idea of, we don't typically use the word husbandman anymore. That's not a word that we typically use. We may have another word in place of that. But the idea, the concept of a husbandman, someone who tends to the vines and dresses the trees and takes care of the plant life, we certainly understand that. Okay? One who tends to the animals, we understand that. We have a hard time, the idea of a shepherd. You know, we don't find that in our culture today. We don't have many people in this country who would be considered shepherds. But do we understand the concept? Yeah, certainly so. Yeah, that apart from where, you know, we have the benefit of a lot of advancements in science and advancements in technology. Shepherds are not quite the thing here as they once were. However, in other cultures, yes, shepherds still are very much a part of the landscape. It's interesting. You'll watch. I watch these videos, and I don't know whether there's something about them that's just appealing to me. You'll see folks that they'll be having they'll have a camera and they'll watch them. People be driving and they'll have to stop while this huge herd of sheep crosses the road or is going down the road. And at the very end, the very back of that, there's a fella there that's standing and he's guiding those sheep. That's a shepherd. Well, if we understand that in our culture, which we certainly can, we can understand what they understood about it in their culture. Same thing. An analogy is often used to make an idea, to make a difficult idea or subject easier to understand. Okay, all right. It's similar to, you know, we've talked about when we talked about hermeneutics and the ability what it takes to understand, to interpret the scriptures the way that we should. We talked about a lot of idioms and figures of speech and parts of speech, and we talked a lot about those. And the idea of rhetoric. While it's an allegory is similar to other rhetorical comparisons, but an allegory is sustained longer and has more details than a metaphor. A metaphor is simply that. You are my sunshine. Okay? You are my sunshine. That's a metaphor. An allegory is something that's a little bit far drawn out, got a few more details. But what it does is enables an allegory to paint a more rich picture. It fills in the blanks that a metaphor doesn't always do. An allegory assigns characteristics to certain things. It assigns details to certain things. And it certainly makes it, while it may not make it any necessarily easier to understand, it paints a greater picture. It's more rich in its details. Well, guess what? When you're speaking to people and you want them to listen, what do you want to do? You want to paint as vivid a picture as you possibly can. That's understandable. Jesus knew that when he was speaking to his followers. When he talked to his disciples, he wanted to make it as easily identifiable and as detailed as he possibly could, or was necessary at the time. Okay? An allegory can be long and complex. I'll give you a couple of examples, and if you've ever read these, you would understand certainly what these allegories were. Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Anybody ever read Pilgrim's Progress? Yeah. I read it when I was much younger. I probably would enjoy it more now, but at the time it was very, anyway. The Divine Comedy by Dante. Anybody read Dante's Inferno? That's part of it. All right, the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno. Okay. All right. George Orwell's Animal Farm. Almost everybody's read that. All right. It's an allegory. It's giving complex political understanding through imagery of animals vying for supremacy on a farm. That's what it is. Okay. And if you've ever read or if you've ever watched a movie like 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's an allegory. I'm not going to go into all of that, but that's what it is. There are a great many movies that have been the same way. A fable or a parable is a short allegory, and it's got one definite moral. You know, a lot of people might take these Aesop's fables, and they might want to assign a detail to every single one of these. Here's what this means, and here's what this means. It's really not the point. The point is that there's one overriding moral behind the whole thing, and that's what we're attempting to get at when we read a parable from Jesus. There's a point, and we can get lost in the details, or we can look for the central point, and that's what we're going to do when we talk about our first one next time. Okay. Fables tend to be longer than parables. Aesop's fables, the ox and the frog. Some of these I had a hard time remembering, even though I've read most of them. The bundle of sticks that we read about, the cat and the birds, the boy who cried wolf. That's Aesop's fable. All right. The fighting cocks that we talked about in a second, and Jupiter and the monkey. I don't remember that one. I'd have to go back and look at that one. There are many fables, as both of those that we just read, that have similar meanings to biblical and Jesus' parables. But there are many more that just simply present good advice that's not necessarily biblical, it's just good advice. For example, can't please everybody. Good advice, right? You can't please everybody. And to try to, you're going to end up being corrupted in some way. When we please everybody, what's going to happen? What's wrong when we're pleasing to every single person? We're not saying what we need to say, right? There's some times where we're going to have to say something that's going to offend. Now, it's not our fault. The biblical truths are going to offend. That's just the way, because what it does is it confronts people in their error. And sometimes we're going to say things that are going to be offensive. It does not mean that we're intentionally trying to hurt people's feelings. It means that we are going to tell the truth, and the truth will offend. Jesus said that. Okay? Not everybody's going to listen to you and be happy with what you're telling them. You know, people are going to hate you for what you're saying because you're saying what I'm saying. Okay? What about this? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Good advice. You've got something. Why in the world would you let it go with the off chance that you might get two of something? Listen, that's the reason folks play the lottery. Yeah. You know, it's funny because a lot of times people think, you know, that two in the bush is good, but then you don't even get the two. All right. Sometimes you don't even get those. All right. So bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. How about if words don't suffice, then blows must follow? Not exactly biblical advice, but sometimes it's good advice. Sometimes words don't suffice. Sometimes it takes physical action to get the point across or to take care of the situation at hand. All right. And last one, misery loves company. Misery loves company. Not biblical advice, but is it true? There are people who they're miserable, and guess what? It's not that they intentionally want you to be miserable, but there's a overarching desire to have you empathize at any cost. Okay, if I'm going to be miserable, everybody's going to be miserable. That's right. Yeah. The old saying is, you know, I don't care what it is, I'm against it. I don't care what it is, I'm against it. You know, doesn't matter what. I've seen people like that. And guess what? There's a truth to that, and we have to confront that truth. All right. Most of the parables. Where do we find most of the parables? I don't think we're going to use this. Where are we going to find most of the parables of Jesus? Which Gospels? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What is the one? There's one parable that we find in the Gospel of John, and we'll talk about that. It's a threefold parable, and we'll talk about that. It's the idea of the goats, the lambs and the goats, and how they'll be divided up. And there are those who are accepting and are acceptable, and those who are not acceptable. But we'll talk about that. But most of the parables are going to be found in the first three Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A synoptic gospel is one that gives a general view of the whole story. It's characterized by comprehensiveness. The Gospel of John is what they call non-synoptic. It's while Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very much they're very straightforward. They give times, places, dates, so forth and so on, much like the book of Acts. It was written in such a way as to give an accurate account of something. John is not quite that way. And the parable that we read in John, it's evident why it was included in the Gospel of John as opposed to the other three. Okay? And we'll talk about that, the idea of a synoptic versus non-synoptic. The idea of a synopsis, when you give a synopsis of something, what are you giving? Yeah, an accurate representation of what's in there. John is not. John is very, I wouldn't want to call it vague, but it's abstract. Okay? There are thoughts that are contained there that are very much abstract, and it's in that regard, it's actually, in my opinion, I wouldn't call it difficult, a more challenging account of the gospel. But it is equally important. It just means that it's different, not that it's less. It just means that it's different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay. Let's see. How many parables are there? How many parables of Jesus are there that we read about in the collected Gospels in the, for example, King James Version, New King James Version, not the extra versions that you read about. The Catholic Encyclopedia lists 33 parables. How many do we read about in the Gospels that we read in the copy of Scriptures, the translation that we typically use? Anybody know? Guess? How many parables? How many parables do we read of in a say modern translation, say the NIV or the New King James or the ESV? Oh, much more. 46. Because there is no word for parable. There is no word for parable in the Bible. That idea of story. A lot of times people don't even realize what should be considered a parable versus what not should be considered a parable. Sometimes he'll say something we didn't realize that was a parable. We're going to talk. Well, we'll go into that a little bit more as we get down the road. But there are 46 parables. There's that. A lot. If you think about a third of everything he spoke to the people was in the form of a parable. 46 of them. So you think about 46 different philosophical, biblical truths that Jesus spoke to the people. A third of his that we read about, that we have to know and understand. A full third of everything he spoke was in the form of parable. Yeah. He did, and you read where he says it is not given for the people he was speaking to. It wasn't given for them to know the things that he was going to tell his apostles. So he would speak to the people in parables, and then in private he would explain what he had spoken to the people. So yes, the audience was essential to understanding what needed to be spoken out. It was essential. So when he was speaking to the people, he spoke in parables. He didn't give them direct revelation as he did his apostles. He spoke to them, and what do you think that did for them? That allowed them to go home and do what? Go their way, to discuss it amongst themselves, right? To go home and to think about, to ponder. We talked about that last week, the idea of what does a parable do? It encourages us to go deeper. It encourages us to think, to ponder, to search ourselves. So there's a reason that he spoke to them in that way. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes, sir. Yeah. I had a professor that was the same way, Bobby Brown at Freed Hardeman, and he didn't go into the parable, but that idea, And but you know what? If you bring that idea home and you think about that, his was when the final that clock would chime, you could hear it all the way across campus. And after that clock, he said, when it finishes its last chime, the door is closed, and he would slam the door. So if you were coming up the stairwell, trying to make it to class, you would hear that door slam, not just close; it would slam shut, and you realize, I'm not getting into that classroom today. I might as well go on back to my room. He's not going to let me in. If you had an assignment due and it wasn't in that classroom when the doorbell or when that last chime rang, it was not accepted, not at all, not late, not for partial credit. It was not accepted at all. And if you think about that very concept, the idea that about when the door is shut, it's sealed forevermore. That idea is it comes home to you, doesn't it? That visual is right there in your face. I've been on the receiving end of that. I was late to his class one time. I didn't realize then he's not joking around. He's not joking around. Well, here's Jesus giving the same parable. When the door is shut, the door is shut. It's not going to be opened up for anyone else. That's it. Well, that parable brings home a very important biblical truth. That's the point that Jesus is trying to get across. There's a point behind what he's saying, and it's up to us to gain an understanding of those things. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. Looking to see if there's anything else I want to talk about today. Like I said, I don't have my answer sheet, so I don't want to get started on our first parable because we're going to have some we're going to be in class. We're going to be taking notes, and we've got the paperwork, all that kind of stuff. They start doing that next week, so we'll pick that up. We'll pick that up then. Nothing else. We're going to go ahead and dismiss. Anybody's got any? If anybody's got anything else, I want to entertain. I don't want it to be a lecture. I do want to entertain. Is there any questions anybody has with parables? Is there something that you're curious about? Is it a parable or not a parable? Is there a question about a parable? Because yes. You think of anything where Jesus uses imagery. Anytime Jesus uses imagery or an analogy or a simile or a metaphor, you can safely discern that would be a parable. It would be a parable, even if it's short in length. A sentence. I think the parable of the mustard seed is basically a compound sentence, and the entire lesson is summed up in that compound sentence. But it holds a great deal of truth, right? Faith is like a mustard seed. Okay, tiny. Have you ever seen a mustard seed? I'm gonna see if I can't find one and bring it in. Have you ever seen them? Those things are tiny. They're like, I've seen those too. And they're tiny. They are just, you think, what in the world could possibly grow out of this? But I've also seen mustard seeds after they've grown up, and they're big enough for birds to come and roost in the branches. So that idea, what kind of lesson that would have taught to his followers about the idea of having faith like a mustard seed? It starts out small. Not everybody jumps. We don't jump in full blown with all of our faith. The whole point of faith is to grow in faith. That's why we do what we do, and our faith grows through God's presence in our lives, is working in our lives. Our faith grows to the point where, as at one point, it was this tiny little. I think it's like the size of a period at the end of a sentence. And then it's a full-blown tree that it's tall. It's not a small plant at all. But yeah, there's a lot of parables that you might think, oh, I didn't even realize about that. The idea of new wine into old wineskins, okay, or patching an old wineskin with a new patch, or a new wineskin with an old patch. That's a parable. Because it's discussing something that's got weightier. It's a weightier matter. It's simply that. All right. Okay. All right. Then we're going to sing the song of invitation. If you need to if you need to take advantage of this opportunity that we're given. Every time we're together, we're given this opportunity, and I appreciate so much when people take advantage of it. I know there are things going on in people's lives that we don't always know about. Sometimes we don't know about them until they very forthrightly come forward and tell us what's going on. But if there is something that you need prayers for or with us, we need to pray with you, for you, on your behalf. To God, we want to do that this morning. So if you need to take advantage of that, please come while we stand and while we sing.
Be free from the burden of sin.